All right, welcome to the Credder Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Palmieri, and with me today is Gabriel Snyder. I'm very excited for this conversation. Gabriel, thanks for coming on today.
Glad to be here.
So you've worked for many different publications over your long career. Why don't we start by maybe you just listing off some of the places you've worked and maybe even the position that you held at each publication?
Sure. I've been a journalist pretty much of one form or the other, pretty much my whole career. I started, my first job was at the New York Observer, which was a weekly paper in Manhattan. I covered the media, was my first job. And then after that, I worked at, Us Weekly and Variety out in LA. I covered the movie industry. And W Magazine. I profiled celebrities, and then I took up editing. I edited Gawker.com a long time ago, and then kind of have been for a big chunk of my career helping news organizations kind of understand how to adapt to the digital landscape. So I worked at Newsweek for a while, overseeing their digital operations. And then I went to the Atlantic, helped them set up an online news site, and then I guess my last staff job was editing the New Republic a few years back. And these days, I kind of am a consultant, and which has been a fun way to kind of visit a lot of different worlds, and including what you guys are doing at Credder.
Yeah, so full disclosure, Gabriel is an advisor of the company. I probably should have gotten that out of the way at the beginning. One thing I really want to dive into with you today is this role of the public editor for a few reasons. One is I think news consumers in general, this is kind of a mysterious position in the newsroom. I don't think many news consumers understand what it means, what the day-to-day is. I'll admit even I'm a little unsure about what the role is. So one of the things that you're doing as a consultant is you're working with the Colombia Journalism Review as the public editor for the New York Times, and you're also based out of New York. So first, why don't you explain to me, or as if it, in the most layman's terms possible, what it means to be a public editor?
So I am, I'm working with the Colombia Journalism Review as in their public editor project. And about a little over a year ago, they appointed 3 public editors for New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and MSNBC. And that was really a response to the fact that the public editors, another word for it is ombudsman, was a very common position for large news organizations like those to have, and they've largely been eliminated. And so CJR had the idea that if these organizations aren't going to have their standing public editors, we're going to appoint them for them. It's led to a little bit of confusion. I think a lot of people on my Twitter, in my mentions, they think I work for the New York Times, which is not true. There's some people at the New York Times who were upset with the whole project because they thought that we were intentionally trying to confuse people, and that I have taken on what had been the public editor role. So what your question was, what was it? And I wish there were a more solid definition, because it's really changed over time, and it's very idiosyncratic from news organization. I think sort of the most textbook example would be an ombudsman. NPR is one of the large organizations that still has one. I think the big public broadcasters like BBC, they tend to have someone in this role. And what that person is they're on staff at that publication, and they're really sort of kind of a blend between internal affairs and customer service. They're basically fielding calls from the public who is consuming the journalism about how it was made, decisions within the organization that might have affected coverage. They're really sort of acting as that representative. Um, you know, the New York Times was the one that coined the public editor, and it wasn't that long ago. I think it was probably about 15 years ago or so. I'd have to go check that date, when they introduced their public editor. And I think for them, they had never really had this ombudsman role, and so they were kind of rethinking it. Um, and they had a series of them, and I would say the most consistent thing about their public editors was that each public editor really redefined the role for themselves, and different styles of approaches. I mean, I think the public editor who did the best, at the role was Margaret Sullivan, who is now a media columnist at the New York, the Washington Post. And it is sort of like being an internal reporter. She was segmented off from the newsroom, didn't really sit on any particular desk, but then went to the office every day and called up, read the paper, and then called up the people who were responsible for making it to ask them about the ways that decisions were made. They ended up eliminating that position a few years ago, and it's become sort of this. And whenever anything happens at the New York Times on Twitter, a very common thing is bring back the public editor. To be honest, I think that's a little bit of a misplaced slogan. I don't think that the experience of the New York Times or anywhere else has shown that public editors or ombudsmen are a panacea for fixing all of the problems of journalism. And I think they've had their own problems. I mean, one of the biggest problems that I've seen with public editors is that it's very difficult to go to work at a place every day and then also be critical of that place. It takes a very specific kind of personality to just walk through the doors of the building every day and then say I'm gonna take my colleagues to task. And so the way that people handle that situation could be different. But I do think that in the CGR project I'm doing, and I feel like I've been talking a long time, so please cut me off or ask me questions. But we have some problems too. I mean, one of the biggest problems is that these aren't full-time roles. I can't. I could very easily, I think, be a public editor for the New York Times as a full-time position, but that isn't really how it's structured. But I do think that the reason that it's good to do this, even as a sort of an outside sort of stopgap role, is that one of the most vital functions that these reader representatives serve is they're just an obvious place to go if you are a member of the public and you have a question about what one of these organizations do. And news organizations as a whole are regularly terrible at talking to their readers. And so I think just putting up a signpost saying questions here and someone is going to take a listen to it is something that that most readers don't have. And I think that when I took on the job, that's really what I kind of was most interested in doing, is just being a place where if people said, why did the New York Times do this? That rather than just posting into the void on social media, they could, I could be a place that they could route those questions to.
Right. And so you must have some kind of a direct relationship or somebody that you can reach out to or you speak to at the New York Times. Is that correct?
I do, but just as as any other media reporter would. I talk to their press desk or their press office. I think the Times editors that I've reached out to have been incredibly responsive, and I really appreciate that. That has not been the experience with all of the organizations in this project. So I hope it doesn't sound like I'm trying to butter up my sources, but it has been helpful, I think, to the project that they have responded and done interviews and things like that.
And
But
were
there's
you?
no, but there's no. I think the one thing that you might be asking, and this is often a misconception around the ombudsman or the official public editors, is that there's some internal structure that gives them access to information.
Mhm.
And I don't know, I don't believe that is regularly the case. And I think that's also been one of the problems that many organizations have had with these, is that the individual in that role doesn't always have, the access to get questions answered. I think, when an organization decides to dedicate a salary to this role, it is a way that the organization is saying, this is important, we take this seriously. And so I think there is sort of probably a lift that job gets when it is in-house. But as far as I know, there's no policy that says, this person gets 30 minutes to talk to the publisher every day to ask them whatever they want, or anything like that.
Would you prefer that that was the case, that maybe you had a representative who you had the bat phone to the New York Times editor's office, and you could ask them, why did you run this headline, or why did you run this story from this perspective? Do you wish that there was more of a direct communication as a public editor?
Um, well, I mean, in some ways I do. I mean, in any journalist would. It's their communications office, um, they're very responsive, and they take questions. I think the problem with what you described is that these organizations tend to be very big, and so there isn't a person that has all knowledge at any on demand. So frequently, a question of how did this decision get made, is no matter who you call. You could call the publisher, you could call the executive editor and say, I want to know, how did this get into the paper? And they would then have to turn around and start making calls themselves and saying, okay. And they have the institutional knowledge to know exactly how those decisions would have gotten made. And they go, okay, I know which desk to call, and I know where to go with that. And they would know that better than an outsider. But it's not as if they have the way to answer questions. Sometimes the questions that I've looked into, they can be very, very small, and who made this decision to write this headline. But sometimes they can be much bigger, and they're questions of a collective effort, of how is a decision made to package a story this way, which is going to involve probably a dozen or more people, in the course of writing and publishing the piece. So
Yeah, so let's take that example. Let's say that you were able to find out who wrote a specific headline that maybe was unnecessarily clickbaity or sensational. Do you feel like it's part of your job to call that person out by name?
I think it is, to the extent that explaining how decisions get made and how publications work, I think is a valuable thing to share with the public. I mean, I think um, journalism is not alone in this, but there's a lot of black boxing that happens where people know what comes out, but they don't really have any idea what goes into the mechanics of it. And I think we, particularly now where there is so much distrust of the media and skepticism, a lot of that, some of it might be merited, but a lot of that is based on assumptions of how decisions get made that are just not based in reality. And so I think journalists could do a lot to advance their cause by just being more transparent about how the sausage is made.
Yeah, and did you ever find out why the New York Times got rid of their in-house public editor?
Um, I have never got. I don't know. I don't know any specifics. I mean, I believe at the time it was a cost cutting measure. I think there might have also been some questions about the effectiveness of that position. Um, the history, gosh, if I believe the public editor was started in the wake of the Jason Blair scandal. I think it was one of the reforms that they kind of picked up, um, and the I guess it's kind of ancient history now, but the Jason Blair was a reporter at the Times who was successfully just made up stories that were printed in the paper, and did so on a number of different beats over an extended period of time, and after the fabrications were revealed, there was a big effort to investigate it. They did a massive investigation of how his stories were allowed to get into the paper, and they did a pretty deep dive on that. And one of the findings was that, kind of going back to that issue of that as this reporter was making up stories, there were people who were able to say that's not true. Like, I know that's not that tree isn't next to that house, or whatever details were wrong. And I think their finding was that they needed to create a better avenue for those kinds of outside criticisms of their own coverage. And again, without trying to describe the specifics, I think the general sense of why they abandoned it is they kind of felt that there were other ways that that kind of information was making its way into the newsroom. And the famous quote that they gave at the time, which is so wrong for so many reasons in hindsight, was Twitter is our public editor now. Sort of this very idealistic early view that Twitter is the free marketplace of ideas, and so they would be able to coast off of that.
So I want to kind of turn to the day-to-day of your role as a public editor. What I imagine is you sitting there and reading every single story that the New York Times puts out and looking for instances of maybe journalistic malpractice or clickbaity headlines or whatever it is that kind of triggers a red flag to you. And then you sit down and you examine that piece further, and then you write a story that essentially holds that story accountable. Is that kind of the correct idea of the day-to-day?
Well, after we have this conversation, I need to work on a column, which I'm very late on filing to my editor. So I feel like anything that makes my day-to-day sound too busy is probably going to get some guffaws. But no, I think what you described was originally what I kind of thought that they were looking for is basically a critic of the paper and someone who sit down and or of their news report. I haven't seen the paper copy in a while now, and I was not interested in playing that role. That is the media criticism role is one that Twitter probably does play a pretty good job at. People or in other social media. I mean, there are more people sharing their opinions of what the qualities of journalism in more places than ever. So I didn't feel like I would just step up and be that voice or another voice. What I always wanted to do was I kind of envisioned it as being a question and answer thing of almost like an advice column where people would send in a question and then I would reply with I'd do a little digging and then I'd reply back. It hasn't worked out that way. I haven't gotten that many questions. Although my DMs are open, and if anyone listening to this has any questions about what they're seeing in the New York Times, by all means, send them my way. So instead, what I've kind of tried to do is focus in on, what are the most important, what do I think are the most important questions about the New York Times and what they're doing right now, and how can I, help people think through, some of these smaller questions, and then also, that ironically, that's kind of I often I think what I've been doing is coasting off of their big blowups. I've written a fair number of columns that are, within a few the 24 hours after, I don't know, they had a bad headline about some Trump remarks on racism. They published a op-ed about by Senator Cotton about sending in troops to the protests, and so I've done sort of very fast reaction kinds of pieces to those. So that's really kind of when, I kind of feel like the Twitter starts going off and the bat signal goes up, and the public editor needs to weigh in. But beyond that, I think I've been trying to think of I think it's not just the Times, but the media right now is going through a massive period of change. And that means that there are some big decisions that are going to have to be made in the next couple of years, and so I've been trying to come up with, kind of set my sights on what are those big decisions and what is the thinking on them at the Times. One of the big questions that I looked at, that keeps on recurring and is very relevant right now, is the way that the Times was involved in the original Biden and Ukraine story, which they really were one of the first major news organizations to talk about that, and it is a new thing for the Times to really see itself as part of a information campaign. I mean, the lessons of the impeachment and that whole saga was that there was a effort by supporters of the president to orchestrate the production of information out of Ukraine that would help his election chances politically. And I think, it's not just the Times, but I think all journalists are now having to confront, like, what does that mean for my job? Like, what kind of considerations ought I to be taking? I mean, the traditional way that journalists have dealt with that conundrum has been a very laissez-faire. I obey certain rules about the information I provide. I have rules for authenticating it, and if it passes those rules, then whatever happens after I publish it, it's not me. But I think the experience of 2016 and the way that a lot of journalists have thought about how they handled information that had been produced by Russian intelligence operations has led some people to question that, and so that was really sort of the way in I went into that story, was like, how does the Times think about this? Because I mean, they have been, the Times is one of the most privileged places in journalism. They don't have to really think about what role they play in the broader ecosystem, because they are the ecosystem, or at least they're the apex of the ecosystem. And so it's been a very, very different thing. I mean, the other story, the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about, even before I did this, took on this role, was just their digital transformation, and more importantly, their business model transformation. The New York Times has been a um, an advertising-driven publication since since Adolph Fox bought it in 1896. It was the also ran. It wasn't an also ran. It was like the 11th ranked paper in New York City. It was dying, and it was truly the failing New York Times in 1896. And the successful competition at the time was the yellow journalism papers of Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst. And they had these loud, colorful, scandalous, basically clickbait, approach to journalism. And the way they made their money is they sold hundreds of thousands of copies for a few cents every day. The New York Times was at that time probably lucky to sell 10,000 copies in a day, and so their circulation revenue was nothing compared to the leaders. And so they embarked on a strategy, starting with this slogan, "All the news that's fit to print," of building a more attractive vehicle for advertisers to reach their consumers. And so, a lot of the early positioning was a paper that you will feel safe bringing home and letting your children open. It's kind of a safe space, and not nothing scandalous in it. And that advertising driven strategy really was it undergirds all of the key decisions that the New York Times made for the next century. And as much as the digital transformation is leading to all sorts of changes in the ways that they tell stories and the kinds of people that they have telling stories, I think the real most important thing happening right now is we're seeing them really retool their entire business to be from a advertising driven one to a subscription driven one. And I don't think, they've been succeeding at that, and they are the market leaders right now in selling new subscriptions. But I don't think we are anywhere close to fully understanding what the repercussions will be for news organizations that are truly subscription driven. There's a caricatured version of this theory, which is that this is going to be terrible for free thinking, and if Bret Stephens writes a column that gets people mad and they're going to cancel their subscriptions, they're going to have to fire Bret Stephens, I guess, is one of the theories that you kind of see floated. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, if you look back and you see how advertising shaped the New York Times, there were I can think of two major things that were driven largely by their advertising strategy. The first was becoming a national newspaper. The early 20th century newspapers tend to have regional monopolies or regional markets. And the New York Times started building satellite presses, and California and Florida and I think Texas were some of the early markets. And it was if you go back and read those announcements, it was a very conscious decision that by printing papers in those markets, they would be a more attractive to advertisers who wanted to reach a national audience and not just reach the New York market. And so there was many decades in which the New York Times was building out that national coverage, which probably is one of the reasons they were well positioned to become a subscription-driven digital newspaper. But it was largely that advertising. The other big change that was driven by advertising was the creation of their features sections in the 70s. This was, I think, dining was one, the arts was another. I think there was a home was one of the first ones. And these sections were very controversial within the Times. They kind of saw them as soft news, that they were But they were responding to the changes. The marketplace. Their business was still at that point largely confined to the New York City area. And what was happening in New York City is that all of the upper middle class was moving out to the suburbs, and the department stores and all of the people who wanted to sell furniture and gardening equipment to these people with new houses in the suburbs, they needed a way to reach them. And so the New York Times said, we'll do it. We'll start putting together weekly sections about these topics. So those, I think when we see how coverage will change because of a subscription model, I think a good example right now is them getting into a TV show. I mean, the reason, as I understand, the strategic reason that they have a TV show on Hulu and FX is because it serves their subscription strategy. That is the top of the funnel. This is how you reach people who don't think about the New York Times. You got to put it on TV. That's what every other advertiser does. What that TV show is, what that, the topics they cover, like, I think all of that is largely inspired by some of this, some of its new subscription thinking. And it's very different from when they tried to do TV. I mean, it's not the first time they've tried to do TV. They had an entire cable channel with Discovery. There was a Times Investigates. I can't remember. And it kind of fell apart, I think, because the making reality TV and putting out a high quality newspaper don't involve the same skill sets.
Right.
and so they were having a lot of trouble translating those two, and also probably the business didn't make as much sense. So I think we may see we're already seeing that they're doing a lot more audio, and that's because what the Daily has shown is that their flagship podcast is, I think it's the reason I hear most frequently is that it habituates people to getting something from the New York Times every day, which is a critical step that they've identified in advancing someone down this process of eventually handing over their credit card and signing up for a subscription. And so I think that process of, okay, we need to habituate people. The answer might be very different of different tactics that they do, but those are probably all going to be very new activities to the New York Times that they wouldn't have done otherwise, because they wouldn't be thinking about that need to always be attracting new subscribers.
Right. I want to ask you a couple ethics questions, if we can, because I think your
Sure.
position as a public editor is kind of a unique position, and so you might have some unique insights on the ethics of some of these trends that are happening with this digital transformation. So recently, the New York Times went ahead and endorsed Joe Biden as president. Now, I don't think that surprised anybody, but what do you think about this trend of news outlets endorsing political candidates? Maybe you can tell me if this is a more recent trend, but it seems to be a growing trend among even smaller outlets who maybe don't have much sway, seem to be getting in on the action. Do you think that news outlets should be expressing preference, which is what it essentially is, for particular political candidates?
Well, let me start with that. Is this a new thing? It's definitely not a new thing. The New York Times, I think, has endorsed a candidate for president every election, certainly that I know of, going back to 1896 and probably earlier. In fact, that's another story for another time. And most newspapers do. I think the what it traces back to is the editorial board, and I don't think magazines and cable news stations don't have editorial boards the same way that that newspapers do. So the traditionally newspapers have a opinion department and a news department, and they're supposed to be very much separate. And so the endorsements are all coming out of the opinion department, and are not supposed to color their coverage of the news department. And so I think that the fact that it seems new is probably a couple things at work. Number one is that I don't know how relevant a lot of these opinion pages are. The opinion desk is not at the Times or anywhere else is not swaying public discussion the way that maybe they did 100 years ago. So it may only seem new. I mean, 2016, I've always joked, is if you needed evidence of how ineffective newspaper endorsements are, the 2016 election is your case example. I mean, I think it was 99% of all newspapers endorsed Hillary Clinton, and I think there was literally like 2 that endorsed Trump. And we know exactly how that election turned out. So it does not look terribly good for the newspaper editorial boards. But that distinction, so not only do they not have a whole lot of sway, but I think that the distinction between the opinion and the news side is not widely understood for readers. It used to be maybe something that would be more obvious if you were physically reading the paper and you would see a different page and articles looked a little different. Now, they have introduced a few changes in display, but if you're just looking around at headlines on social media, there is no big distinction between those two. And the New York Times endorses Biden, and the New York Times gets Trump's tax returns seem like they're coming from the exact same place and the exact same voice, even though internally they would think of it as very, very separate. The other new phenomenon that has happened is that this cycle there seem to be publications that have never had endorsements before have started having endorsements. Scientific American, I think, did an endorsement, and the medical journal, was it New England Journal of Medicine? I can't remember, but it was one of the medical journals. And they got a lot of attention because it was the first time in their 120-year history that they did. And again, I think those would be very different decisions than the Times or other new editorial boards doing that. I mean, they're endorsing because that's just what they do. That's what they've done every election. These other organizations, these smaller sort of science places, have been kind of making a point of saying that we've made a collective decision that the stakes involved in this election touch on our core area of competence, and so we want to express a preference between candidates.
Right. I believe Scientific American justified the endorsement by saying essentially that climate change is real, it poses a threat to life on Earth, and therefore, as a scientific journal, they should stand for a more pro-science candidate, in their opinion. I think that was the rationale given.
Yeah, I think that was definitely part of it. I think the other part that I remember sort of reading, I'd have to go back and see this, was just sort of that the value of science was at stake. That that they saw that you had 2 competing, decision processes, or methods of making decisions were being advanced by the candidates, and the one was prioritizing scientific method, and the other one was not, and they felt that a challenge like climate control or climate change was an area where if you kind of just had a political process that it would have catastrophic effects versus something that they are in favor of, which is a much more rigorously scientific.
Right. Another trend that I wanted to get your thoughts on is this trend of billionaires acquiring news outlets. Now, I don't necessarily think this is something new. Obviously, rich people have owned uh, media companies since media companies have existed. But with this kind of fraught revenue model situation that many publishers are facing these days, it seems like some billionaires are coming to basically offer to bail them out and run them at almost as a loss leader, just to make sure that the brand and that organization can continue doing the work. I don't blame these outlets. Obviously, you got to keep the newsroom going. Survivability is core to any business. What do you think about this trend in general? Is this a net good? Is this a net negative? How do you think about these kind of acquisitions of these newsrooms?
Well, the biggest problem with billionaires owning publications is it's the definition of idiosyncratic outcomes, right? You are making these organizations stand on the personal, interests of one very wealthy individual, and I think if we look at the recent examples of what happened, the only thing that is the same is that there was a big change once one of those people changed their mind. And so I don't think it's a particularly good, I don't think it's a sustainable model for journalism. I don't think the world has enough billionaires to, offer consistent economic support. And what was the second part of your question?
Just about whether it's net good or net bad. I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is it is possible to think that, okay, Jeff Bezos acquired either the entire Washington Post or a large stake controlling interest in the Washington Post, and Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, acquired Time Magazine. Is it possible to think that in the future we have kind of media wars amongst billionaires, or is it more likely that these billionaires would agree to basically, I won't go after you with my paper if you don't go after me with your paper?
I don't think that we're ever going to have a stable enough billionaire driven media ecosystem that those kinds of long-term trends will have a chance to take root. We the central problem with journalism right now is there is no one knows what a good sustainable business model is, and the billionaires who've stepped in, none of them, well, I should say none, few of them that and I don't know of any, are signing up to be long-term benefactors to these organizations. Typically, I think, well, a not uncommon element of these billionaire acquisitions is usually a belief that whatever business success that they had that contributed to their billions of dollars of wealth can be applied to this problem of figuring out a new business model for journalism. And so, often one of the biggest problems is that when that idea doesn't work, then the interest of the billionaire tends to wane. And you see sales, you see shutdowns and whatnot. And that, I mean, the pattern that keeps on repeating is you have a billionaire buys it, and then all of a sudden the money problems are solved. There's big hires, and everyone is happy at the newsroom. And then you fast forward about 2 years, and the numbers on whatever strategy they put into place start coming in, and they aren't there. And then they start cutting, and they go, the place goes back into misery. So that doesn't, this idea that billionaires will, like, one day will be in a place where every billionaire has to have their own news organization so that they can battle out with each other. In a way, that might actually be useful. That might actually be helpful to journalism. But I don't think we're on our way there. I mean, it hasn't, for better or for worse, owning a news outlet has not been shown to be a terribly useful thing for a billionaire at this point. No one has used it to, I don't know, drive their business or their reputation. There is a long history of the press in America being primarily driven by partisan interest and by business interest, and there was, up until the 20th century, there wasn't an expectation of an objective press. It was very much kind of thought about who you read was based on who you voted for, and so we may be heading, that sort of that I call it the great aberration of the 20th century, may mean that we're just heading back to a much more 19th century earlier version of press, where there isn't anyone who's viewed as trusted, and instead it is just a whole bunch of competing partisan elements that are battling with one another, whether or not they have billionaire support or not.
Yeah, the media landscape in general is getting more competitive now that technology has allowed pretty much anybody with an internet access to become a quote-unquote journalist or a publisher of content online, specifically when you look at things like Medium and Substack. What do you think about this trend of basically opening up journalism to anyone who decides to write a story? Is this net benefit to journalism as a whole because more people are getting involved? There's maybe more opportunities for light to be shed on stories that might not have gotten the attention? Or is it perhaps net negative because it's drawing attention away from the quote unquote real journalists who have the pedigree and the expertise to cover these topics?
My bias is, I don't believe any individual can do journalism. I think journalism is a collective effort. And so these models in which of citizen journalism, to me, are fundamentally flawed versions of journalism, because stories get better when more than one set of eyes is on them, and there's debates about the phrasings of leads and headlines and all of those sorts of things, and I think so that's always been, to me, the thing that sometimes we have on, like, you'll have big news events where someone will be live streaming from an event, and I can watch it on Twitter, and people rightfully laud that as a technological marvel of, like, how this is amazing that this information, which used to be mediated through satellite trucks and and a happenstance of whether or not a news crew was there, is now we have so much more access to it. That's a great thing, but to me that isn't journalism. That's more of a raw information gathering, and the process of taking a day's worth of news, a week's worth of news, a month's worth of news, and thinking about it and figuring out prioritizing and teasing and analyzing and all of that effort that goes on within a newsroom, that to me is something that is not being done effectively by these new models of distribution, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're coming through to the kind of last round of questions here, if you'll entertain me. What is the most important story you've ever worked on, either by editing somebody else's story or whatever story it was in the newsroom that you had your fingers on? What is the most important story that you either helped break or that you were working on? And then what is the most important story that news consumers should be following today, whether they're aware of this story or not?
All right, so the most important news story, I think it might have been, it was a story that I worked at when I was a film reporter at Variety. One of the stories I covered, then this was in 2004, and there were two big movie stories that year. One was the release of Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, which made a ton of money. Yeah. And right after it was was Michael Moore's documentary Fahrenheit 9/11, which also made a ton of money. I was on the box office beat at the time, which regularly meant that I would wake up on Sunday mornings and people at studios would call me and read out how much money all their movies made that weekend. So hearing about all these plans and all of the guerrilla marketing that they were doing, it was just a unique movie marketing story, and it became one of the big stories I covered that year. And the one story that I specifically remember, and at the time it was a minor story. I don't think it got played anywhere in the paper very high, but there was a lawsuit against a complaint filed with the FEC against Michael Moore and his film distribution companies, saying, basically claiming that their TV ads violated the campaign finance laws. That there was a campaign finance law, the McCain-Feingold rules, which were not very old at that point. They had established this rule that no outside group could put up an advertisement that mentions a federal candidate within a certain number of days of an election. And so these commercials that they had of Fahrenheit 9/11 had a bunch of pictures of George Bush. It started off with, I think, a news clip of him swinging at a golf ball. And so the lawsuit was basically saying, hey, this is against this campaign finance rule. Well, it turns out that the complainant in that case was a group called Citizens United, and they were basically trying to get the entire McCain-Feingold and all campaign finance regulations thrown out by the courts. And this story, when this lawsuit, this complaint against Michael Moore, was one of the first steps in the landmark decision of Citizens United, which basically deregulated campaign finance in our country and is the reason why we're awash with dark money every election now. And so I always think of that story when you ask the question, because at the time it was an afternoon of work and I moved on to the next. But only later did I realize that this was going to be one of the most impactful questions that I dealt with. But and it was kind of great because no one was paying any attention to it. So I got I think 3 members of the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, to talk to me on the phone about it, and they kind of gave me the preview of it. So typical kind of story of, you never know what the importance of your daily coverage is going to be.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. I love that. What about the most important story happening right now that either is being underappreciated or is properly appreciated, but people need to stay on top of?
Well, I mean, I think the most important, I don't know if it's the most important story in the world, but the most important story as far as the media and the shape of the media to come is likely I would nominate the antitrust investigations going on about on the digital giants. I don't think it is a coincidence that politics has gone haywire globally in the same decade that social media took over, the world. And the monopoly level, or not monopoly, but just the dominance of these platforms in the discourse is huge. And so, what that future looks like is largely going to spin on what is the government regulation of those platforms going to be, and how they do business. I don't know how it's going to. I make no predictions of the outcome of that, but I do think that's probably going to be the thing that, looking back 10 years, would say, yeah, that was what set this in motion.
Yeah, that's a huge story to be following. I'm not going to make any predictions either, but I do feel a little troubled at kind of the lack of technical knowledge that some of these regulators have, and a little bit of the showmanship that they seem to put on when they do finally get these CEOs in front of them. It seems like they're more trying to create a nice 2-minute attacking the CEO video that they can then show to their constituents the next time the re-election comes around, so that they can look tough on big tech. It feels a little bit more like a show to me than, a good faith effort and technical analysis on how to properly regulate these companies. So personally, I'm skeptical of any regulation with teeth coming through, but that's definitely a huge story. So I have 2 final questions, but before we do them, and these ones are kind of fun, and I'm going to be asking, obviously you're episode number 1, congratulations, but I am going to be asking these 2 fun questions to every guest that comes on the podcast from now until the end of time. But before we ask those 2 questions, can you give listeners information on where they can follow your work, either at the Colombia Journalism Review or your Twitter account, wherever you would want to send anyone listening to follow your work?
Probably Twitter is still my best destination. So I'm at Gabriel Snyder. And as I say, my DMs are open if anyone ever wants to get in touch with me. That's the best way.
Okay, great. So here are the final 2 questions. Question number 1, Bitcoin, believer or not so much?
Bitcoin, no. Blockchain, yes.
Okay. And my last question, are we living in a simulation? Yes or no?
I do enjoy reading about the theories of how we could be, but I have yet to be convinced. I still believe in reality.
Okay. All right. Well, that does it for this episode of the Credder Podcast. Gabriel Snyder, thank you so much for joining us on episode number 1. Take care.
Thank you so much.